Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. John Carter was heading to an old factory to start his new job, with the cold night wind cutting against his face. As he parked his car and approached the large iron gate in front of the factory, the silhouette of the massive structure looked unsettling. The factory had long been filled with unused machines, rusted pipes, and abandoned storage rooms. However, it still required active security measures. Rumor had it that sometimes unauthorized people entered the building. When John saw the job, he applied without much thought. For a few nights he was supposed to check the building, watch the cameras, and patrol the premises. It seemed like an easy job. He pushed open the large, creaky door and entered. It was darker inside than he expected. Old fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, flickering sporadically and casting a pale light. John took a deep breath and walked toward the security office. The small security room was located near the entrance, in one corner of the building. Inside, there was a desk, a few monitors, and a dusty chair. On the desk lay an old security logbook. John opened it and quickly skimmed through the pages. The last guard's notes were brief and contained ordinary security reports. However, he noticed that the last few pages had been hastily torn out. As midnight approached, John decided to go on his patrol. Walking through the long corridors, the silence was deafening. He glanced into the large machine rooms. Everything seemed normal. But when the clock struck 12, he heard a mechanical sound coming from the depths of the factory. John froze. He recognized that sound. A machine was running. But how? The factory had been inactive for years, and all power sources should have been turned off. Quickening his pace, he headed towards the source of the sound. When he reached a large production area, he saw a massive metal press machine slowly moving on its own. There was no one near it. He looked at the electrical panel. Everything seemed to be off. A sense of unease settled over him. Maybe I just imagined it, he reassured himself. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard footsteps coming from a long corridor on his left. Someone was walking. John raised his flashlight and headed toward the sound. The walls illuminated by the light were damp and smelled of mold. When he reached the end of the corridor, he found that there was no one there. But at that moment, he heard a faint rustling sound behind him. His heart started racing. He turned around and noticed that the light in the security office was on. He quickly ran back there to check. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He took a deep breath to steady himself and slowly opened the door. The room was empty, but the chair was gently rocking, as if someone had just been sitting there and got up moments ago. An indescribable chill ran down his spine. He scanned the room, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling of unease inside him only grew stronger. He looked at the monitors. The cameras still showed empty corridors and old machines. "I'm just tired," he muttered to himself and took a deep breath. But then he noticed movement on one of the cameras. On the screen, a shadowy figure quickly disappeared down one of the corridors. He blinked and looked again, but there was nothing there anymore. Was it just an illusion? Or was he really not alone in the factory? John focused on the screen, trying to determine if his eyes were deceiving him. He wasn't sure whether what he had seen was real, but his unease was steadily increasing. He checked the cameras one by one. All the corridors, rooms, and storage areas appeared empty. But his instincts told him this wasn't just an illusion. He stayed in the security room a little longer, listening to the silence around him. All he could hear were the faint creaks from the old walls and the sound of the wind hitting the metal roof. However, just as he was about to take his eyes off the monitors, something caught his attention. In the top right corner of the screen, a shadow appeared and quickly vanished down one of the corridors. John immediately sprang up from his seat and moved closer to the monitor. The shadow was heading toward the large machine area. His heart raced faster. He took a deep breath, grabbed his flashlight, and started walking down the corridor. The factory was filled with long corridors that seemed like a labyrinth. John carefully moved toward the area where he had seen the shadow on the monitor. Footsteps echoed in the dim light. This building, long abandoned, had an eerie atmosphere, as if it were breathing on its own. When John reached the large production area, he shone his flashlight around. The old machines were rusted and still. Everything was motionless. However, he felt that something was different here. A faint breeze hinted at the presence of a non-existent open door. John continued to carefully inspect his surroundings, but after finding nothing, he took a deep breath and decided to turn back. Just as he was about to turn around, he noticed something had changed. The door, which had been open when he entered, was now completely shut. A knot formed in his throat. He immediately walked toward the door and reached for the cold metal handle. He pulled to open the door, but it was locked. At that moment, he felt movement behind him. A deep, muffled breath echoed in the air. John froze. He turned his trembling flashlight toward the sound, but there was no one there. Still, the feeling of someone standing right behind him crept up on him. With an instinctive sense of fear, he tugged at the door again and finally managed to open it. Out of breath, he hurried back toward the security room. His heart was pounding wildly. When he entered the room and closed the door behind him, he took a deep breath and ran his trembling hands through his hair. Something was not right in this factory. Just as he sat down at his desk, he noticed a cup of coffee in front of him. The coffee was still warm. John's eyes widened. He hadn't brought coffee with him when he arrived at the factory. He knew he was alone here. But now there was a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Holding his breath, he turned around, but no one was in the room. As John tried to understand what was happening, he realized something. He was not alone here. And this was only the beginning. John swallowed as he stared at the hot coffee. The only thought running through his mind was, "This is impossible." Who could have placed the coffee there? He had locked the door, and he was sure he was alone in the factory. A chill ran through him. He took a deep breath and picked up the cup. He noticed his hand was shaking. The surface of the coffee was trembling slightly due to the faint breeze in the room. But where was this breeze coming from? The windows were closed. He knew the air conditioning wasn't on. He stood up and scanned the corners of the room. There had to be someone here. But who? And why were they hiding? He turned back to the security monitors. He checked the cameras one by one. Empty corridors, rusted machines, abandoned chairs. Everything seemed normal. However, the camera showing his office flickered for a moment. Static noise spread across the screen, and the image distorted. John quickly sat back down in his chair and stared intently at the screen. The distorted image cleared up within seconds, but what he saw froze him in place. In the office, sitting in the very chair he had been occupying, was someone else. John blinked. Was he seeing things? No. On the screen, just a little further, behind his own position, a shadowy figure was sitting. Its head was lowered, as if staring at the desk. But John was there. And right now, he was alone. His throat tightened. He leaned closer to the monitor. The figure in the image suddenly lifted its head and turned toward the camera. It was smiling. John jumped out of his chair. His heart was racing. Was this some kind of joke? Was it a camera recording? He quickly glanced around the room. When he turned back, the person he saw on the monitor was no longer there. But something had changed. One of the chairs was gently rocking. A deep fear gripped John. He wasn't alone in the factory, and something was watching him. But what was this thing? He took a step back and walked toward the door. All he wanted was to finish this night and see the morning. But just as he reached for the doorknob, the door slowly opened on its own. John's breath caught in his throat. No one was visible in the doorway, but he could feel someone inside. An invisible presence was watching him. John, feeling fear in every cell of his body, instinctively turned around and looked back at the monitors. A figure was sitting in the office, but this time, it was standing and walking toward him. John froze as he saw the figure on the monitor approaching him. The shadowy figure, which seemed to be made of shadows, moved slowly toward him, and the image on the screen began to distort. Static noise rose, the screen shook, and suddenly everything went dark. All the lights in the room went out at once. Remembering that the door was still open, John stood frozen. For several seconds, he could only hear his own breath. His heart was pounding wildly then. Slow, echoing footsteps came from deep within the corridor. Someone, or something, was approaching him. John panicked and turned on his flashlight, pointing it down the hallway. However, the light could only illuminate a few meters ahead, in the pitch-black darkness. The footsteps stopped. But he could feel that something was there. Just as he was about to attempt to flee, he heard a whisper behind him. It was thin, nearly inaudible, but it seeped into his ears. "Don't go." John quickly turned around and pointed his flashlight back into the room. But there was no one there. He couldn't stay here anymore. The fear of losing his job was nothing compared to the panic growing inside him. He decided to leave the factory, but just then, a beep came from the computer. John turned back to the monitors. The screen had come back on, but the images were not normal. All the cameras were showing the same thing. In the corridors, in the rooms, between the machines, in every corner, there were moving black shadows. Some disappeared quickly, while others stayed in place and stared directly at the camera. John's blood ran cold. One of the screens started showing the factory's old security footage. He was sure he hadn't opened these recordings, but the screen now showed a guard who had gone missing years ago. The man was sitting in the security room, just like John. Then he turned toward the camera, and he smiled. At that moment, the footage cut off, and a single message appeared on the screen. "You will be with us too." John jumped out of his chair. He ran toward the door, but the door slammed shut on its own. Behind him, a black shadow appeared, and it was moving toward him. John's body felt like it was frozen. With the door slamming shut, he was trapped in the room. Gasping for breath, he shakily pointed his flashlight toward the shadow. But the light didn't illuminate the presence. The shadow passed through the light, its shape unchanged, still moving toward him. John panicked and stepped back, stumbling into the desk. The flashlight fell to the floor and rolled across the room. As the shadow's silhouette became more distinct, John thought he saw its face for a moment. That face was his own, but paler, with hollowed-out eyes and with a terrifying smile on its lips. It stood directly in front of John. Was this a hallucination? Was his mind playing tricks on him due to sleep deprivation? Just then, the monitors flickered again, and the old security footage opened once more. As John looked at the screen, he saw an old night guard from years ago wandering through the factory corridors. The man was holding a notebook, just like the incomplete security log John had found on his first day. The old guard walked into the camera's view, and at that moment, a dark figure appeared behind him. John shuddered. The man suddenly lifted, his head turned toward the camera, and gave that same terrifying smile. Then, the screen went black. John jumped up and tried to open the door, but it still wouldn't budge. For a few seconds, he didn't know what to do. But he couldn't stay inside. He had to find a way out. The basement. He had heard that there was a basement used for storage in the lower floors of the building. Maybe there was a door leading outside. From there, he grabbed the flashlight and forced the door open. After a few attempts, the door suddenly gave way, and John stumbled out. As he stepped away from the dim light of the office and into the dark corridors, everything became even more eerie. Silence, the buzzing fear in his ears, and faint whispering sounds from a distance. When he found the basement stairs, he pried open the iron door and stepped inside. A heavy smell of mildew filled his nose. The stairs, with their rusty iron railings, led downward. As he descended, strange drawings began to appear on the walls. At first, they looked like meaningless scribbles, but when he brought the flashlight closer, his skin crawled. The drawings depicted human figures. They had no faces. Empty eye sockets, irregular body shapes, and long, thin arms, and the largest figure among them was that of a dark entity, the same shadow he had seen throughout the night. With trembling hands, John touched one of the drawings. Just as he did, the stone wall beneath his fingers vibrated, and from behind him, a deep, rasping breath echoed. John slowly turned around. A pair of pale eyes were staring at him from the darkness. John's breath caught in his throat. With trembling hands, he pointed the flashlight toward the eyes, but the light only illuminated the empty wall. Yet, he could feel something there. When he took a step back, he noticed something crunching beneath his feet like dry leaves. He pointed the flashlight down and found old yellowed papers and a worn diary. The diary's cover had a name written in fading ink: Thomas Grayson. The name sounded familiar. He had read in the old security records that a night guard had gone missing here years ago. Thomas Grayson, the man who had disappeared here years ago. With shaking hands, John opened the diary. The handwriting on the pages was uneven, as if written in haste. Some words were too faint to read, but a few lines were clear. There is something here. It's watching me. Every night it's getting closer. I feel its presence at all times. Its shadow pours over the walls. But the scariest part is, sometimes I see my own face. I tried to escape, but you can't escape. Once it sees you, you become a part of it. John's stomach churned. Just then, a deep scratching sound came from behind the wall at the back of the diary. John quickly turned his flashlight toward the wall. The stone wall that had been empty moments ago was now slowly being covered by a moving shadow. It was as though something was trying to crawl out of the dark wall. John dropped the diary and backed away toward the stairs. But just as he was about to turn, the door slammed shut on its own. He was trapped in the basement. John desperately tried to open the door, but whispers began rising from behind him. At first, there was just one voice, then two, then three. Soon the entire basement was filled with whispering voices. You can't escape. It sees you. You'll be one of us. John turned around in terror, and there it stood, the shadow, or the entity with John's own face, pale, decayed face, hollow eyes, and a smile that glowed in the darkness. John screamed and pounded on the door, but it was futile. The shadow slowly approached him, and John's mind began to blur. The last thing he saw was the entity with his own face staring into his eyes. The last thing he heard was a hoarse whisper coming from his own mouth. Now, you're one of us. The next morning, when the owner of the factory arrived, the security office was completely empty. There was no trace of John. Upon reviewing the security footage, the last recordings showed John sitting in his office, turning toward the camera and flashing a horrific smile, just like Thomas Grayson and the other night guards before him. The factory began searching for a new night guard.